Hey friends, welcome to Flite Test Tech. I'm Josh. Today we're going to be showing you how to assemble the Flite Test Guardian and mainly how to solder your components around our common Power Pack G. Now the neat thing about this, whether you're building a Guardian or a different Gremlin frame, the steps are pretty much going to be the exact same of how I show you how to set it up here. Now if you're new to the hobby and you're new to Gremlins are a fantastic way to get into multi-rotors and learn how to fly. Also, another really great benefit of Gremlins is they work great indoors and also outdoors. Now with this build, you are going to need some basic soldering skills, but don't worry, if you're new to soldering, we have a really great video showing you tips and tricks how to have great success. The tools you're going to need for this build is a soldering iron with a fine tip, solder, flux, and also a screwdriver and a 1.5mm hex. Now this is a multi-part video. Basically in this video we're going to be showing you how to solder your motors and mount them, and then we're going to be passing them on to our friend Wes to show you how to hook up Betaflight and how to program everything on your quad on the computer. At that point, all you simply need to do is put your top plate on and you're ready to fly. Let's go ahead and get our materials in order and we'll get started. Now the easiest way to get started when you're building your Gremlin, whether it's a Guardian or any Gremlin, is to actually fasten your motors down and also your control board down, and then use that kind of like as an easy way to hold everything in place while you're soldered together. So that's going to be the very first thing we're going to do. We're going to take out the lower plate of our FT Guardian and we're going to go ahead and mount our motors and also the standoffs for our main control board. Let's go ahead and do that right now. So we have our plate right here. We're also going to grab all 4 of our motors. And while we're at it, we'll locate our pigtail and our ESCs and Flite control board. Along with this, we also have our FPV camera and our satellite receiver that we'll want to connect. But let's first go ahead and concentrate on these pieces here, and then we'll go ahead and get those in solder when it's time. I'm going to put these aside and I'm going to open up my motors. These motors attach with a 1.5mm hex. Make sure you have one of those. If you don't have one, we have a really great combo tool that's included with our crafty kit that has your Phillips head, your 2, your 2.5, and of course your 1.5. Basically, while we put this together, we're pretty much going to build the bottom portion of the frame facing up, and then we're going to use the standoffs and the guides to mount it. I'm going to locate my short screws. You have different lengths here. It's always a really important thing whenever you're mounting your motors that you're very careful to not accidentally use too long of screws and go into the windings. If you do that, what will happen is you'll short out your motor, and you'll not only destroy your motor, but you'll also possibly destroy your ESC. Whenever I fasten down my motors, I always make sure that I don't thread them in all the way tight until I have all 4 of my screws properly threaded. You can choose to use blue Loctite if you wish. The one thing I'd strongly recommend is don't use red Loctite. You'll never get them off. Now when I'm mounting my motors, specifically for the Gremlin, I'm going to go ahead and take it horizontally parallel to the control board, and then I'm going to angle it in around the standoff at 90 degrees. This is going to give us a very nice clean setup and also keep the wires away from the props. So all my motors here, I'm going to go ahead and face inwards and then wrap them around the standoff, and that will then take me to my control board. So there's one. Now that I have all 4 in there, I can just tighten that down. And let's go ahead and do that 4 more times. Now you can see here, this is the rear of my Guardian, this is the front of my Guardian, and my leads are going to go right towards this center post right here, and then they're going to go 90 degrees right into my control board. Let's go ahead and take the other motors in, and all of those are going to point towards the same center post and then in towards the control board. Again, we're making sure that we're not using too long of screws that are going to touch the windings. Only just long enough to go through the bottom plates. So the short or the medium screws is the longest ones you want to use. Now that we have all 4 of our motors mounted, let's go ahead and locate the standoffs for our control board that's located in with our control board and 4-in-1 ESC combo. We're going to also need 4 screws from our motors to be able to mount the standoffs through the bottom of our Gremlin frame. You're going to see that on the Guardian specifically, we have different holes for mounting different size boards, whether it's 16, 20, or 25. For this board, we're going to go through the 16mm hole mounts. And we're just going to mount the standoffs from the bottom. The rest of our hardware we're going to put aside safely here because we're going to be using that when we mount our 4-in-1 stack here. So let's go ahead and put this off to the side where it's nice and safe. Make sure it doesn't roll off the table anywhere. And at this point we have everything we basically need to kind of act as a helping hand for us where we can solder it together easily. Now that we have our 4 standoffs installed, let's go ahead and locate our 4-in-1 ESC, and we're going to mount this upside down temporarily. We're not going to screw it in, and then mount our pigtail. This is our 4-in-1 ESC. You're going to notice that the top of the ESC has a connector that goes to a little ribbon cable that'll connect our main control board. On the very bottom, you're going to see the 2 main solder points for our pigtail. We're going to go ahead and make sure that we solder this to the B- for negative and B+ for positive. Also, I have a voltmeter with me, and anytime that we do some major soldering, especially around something that requires polarity, we're going to go ahead and check that with a voltmeter to make sure we have no shorts anywhere. So an easy way to solder this together is to simply push this right down over top of our standoffs here. It'll just do a nice little friction fit like you see here. We're going to locate our pigtail. I already have my soldering iron turned on, I have my flux, and I have my solder here. A nice little handy tip here is to take something like a barbecue skewer, and you can use that to dip in your flux and kind of rub on the pads that you need, or you can even dip this and tin this by just dipping it in the flux. Flux is simply going to make your solder flow a little bit easier and be less blobby. Now, if you're new to soldering, I definitely recommend that you check out our video on Soldering 101. It's going to give you some great tips. It's a really good idea to make sure you have soldering down before you go ahead and move on to this. Now, to make things easy, I'm just going to rub a little bit of flux using my wooden barbecue skewer. That way I'm not scratching any boards, right on my two pads. Now that I have my flux on, I'm going to wet the tip of my soldering iron. I'm just going to flow just a little drop on the B+ and the B-. You may see the solder on this cling to the capacitors. That's okay. And I'm going to carefully line up my B- with the negative wire. Flow that right down on top of itself. If you have any caffeine in you, make sure you have nice smooth hands. There's one. I'm gonna hold this down. And there is two. Now, if your solder doesn't look good, if it's not smooth, if it's not shiny, I definitely recommend reflowing that out. This looks nice. I gave it a little bit of a tug. I'm also gonna come in with my voltmeter, turn it to continuity, turn my buzzer on. And if I touch this across the positive and negative, I shouldn't hear any continuity. That's great. Also, I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to make sure that I have proper continuity between my ground and the far pin across it from my ribbon cable. So I'm going to hold that there. I'm going to take this right down to this far pin. That's perfect. Next one over is my power. I'm going to go to that second pin. And when I go to my ground, you'll notice that there's no continuity, but when I go to my positive, there is. That's perfect. So no shorts, everything is working good. We can move on to our next step. Now at this point, what I like to do is I like to go ahead and mount the lower control board into place here. Now I don't need to screw this down in quite yet, but what I can do is go from flipping it inverted to the proper direction. And also while I'm mounting it, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put the standoffs, specifically the one that goes on both sides of my pigtail and the ones that the motors are gonna wrap around. That way I can guide my wires a little bit easier and make sure it's also routed all at the same time. You'll notice that we're kind of building our frame as we're soldering this together. The rear of the frame, you're gonna notice tucks in just a little bit more, and you'll see the two holes for the antenna to pop through on both sides for some of our applications. There we go. I'm just going to open up the pigtails just a little bit. I'm going to slide this right over the top here, press it forward, just like that. Now we have a nice reinforced area. When we push this in, it's not going to go anywhere, but it's also not pinching on the wires too badly. Now that our 4-in-1 ESC is mounted right side up, and also we have our pigtail around the rearmost post, we're going to go ahead and tin our solder pads. Now it's really important that we don't get too much solder on this and short between our post ground and also our post positive. Again, I'm going to take my time, make sure that I don't get too much solder, especially on the quarter pads. With these small control boards, it's really important that you don't get the pins too hot. So a lot of people think more heat is more control. It's not the case at all. Now that we have our 4-in-1 ESC all pre-tinned and our motor leads are pre-tinned, let's go ahead and take one motor lead at a time. And for example, we have our front right motor. We're going to go to the front right bank of 3 connections. So here's my front motor, here's my 3 connections. So my first lead on that motor is going to go around, and I'm just going to go ahead and take it there. Now Wes later on in a different video is going to be showing you how to set up Beta Flite, how to set up the controller. There's a really cool way that you can reverse your motors without having to unsolder them and switch the order of your motor leads. The way the Guardian is designed, you don't have to do any cutting specifically with these 1104 motors. It'll simply just fit right on. So I'm just going to go ahead and hold that motor lead right over top. I'm going to flow the solder together. And with a nice stable hand, there we go. I'm going to hold it there. Little gentle tug after a few seconds, make sure it's firmly attached. If the lead doesn't look right, resolder it. The neat thing about this is you can actually feel the wire drop right down into your solder. Little tug. All three of those are on. Let's go to the other side now. Again, with these corner ones, I'm looking very carefully just where that post goes through to make sure none of our solder or that motor lead wire doesn't go over and touch that. That looks good. Let's go ahead and do the other side, and then we'll come back with our voltmeter and we'll check and make sure we don't have any shorts. You can see with absolutely no cutting how nice and clean everything's routed. Also, when this is finally put together, you don't have to worry about the leads coming up and hitting your prop blades. This would be a really good time to just take one last inspection over all your leads, make sure you're happy with the solder joints. I like to be a little bit more rough when I'm putting this together because if it breaks by handling it, it could easily break by an accidental crash or maybe just simply by using it over and over again and hitting it against the ground. So don't be afraid to tug on your wires and inspect them and make sure there's no issues. Now that we have all of our motor leads soldered on, I'm going to go ahead and do another continuity check just to make sure nothing's shorted out. Now it's really important here that we don't accidentally have continuity between these posts on the corner and this little lead here. So what we should see is if I touch this down, I'm touching a motor lead and I'm touching the corner post, we shouldn't see continuity. But we should see continuity between these three guys here. Same here, but no continuity between here, which is good. These three leads here, but no continuity here. And finally, last two, and no continuity there. Now that we have our 4-in-1 pretty much all done, we can go ahead and install our 4 standoffs here that'll allow us to put our control board on the top. You don't have to make these overly tight, just friction fit. All right, you can see after we made our motor connections that everything looks good. We checked everything out. I'm just gonna go ahead and tuck these leads in. We're ready to move on to our next step here, and let's go ahead and put our attention towards soldering our FPV camera and also our receiver lead. So right now we can go ahead and put this to the side, and what I'd like you to do is locate your main control board right here. Now with your main control board, it's very difficult to see, but you're gonna see that we have different voltage outs, we have signals, we have grounds. The first thing we're gonna solder on is gonna be our pigtail for our satellite receiver, mainly Spectrum for this one. Let's go ahead and loosely put that in place, and that way we can solder on our signal wires, our ground wires, and our 3 volts for a receiver. Now you're gonna see little tiny arrows right here and here. Those arrows are gonna point towards the nose, so that'll point to the opposite direction of the pigtail and sit down just like that. Now that our standoffs are installed and our main control board is loosely mounted in the proper orientation, we're next going to install the pigtails for our lemon receiver. Now, if you're doing FR Sky or you're doing anything different, you may have a different voltage requirement. For specifically this one, this lemon receiver is going to require a 3 volt, a signal, and a ground. And if you look at the very front of this, you're going to see a G, a 5, an S, and a 3. Now, it's really important to know that the S and the 5 look very similar to each other. So take your time to make sure you're soldering to the right pin. Now this lead is plenty long and we have 2 identical ends here. We're going to be able to trim this to the exact size we need. And the location of our lemon receiver is going to be double side taped right underneath. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to have enough length to be able to solder this and then come around and plug into this end right here. So the easiest way to do this is I'm just going to plug this in, make sure that it's proper. I'm going to hold this down in place. And I'm not going to fight this. Looks like we have about 1.5 inches. And you don't have to worry because if you cut it too short accidentally, you have another side to try. It's a lot easier to unwind these. And because these ends are not pre-tinned, I'm just going to carefully strip off about 1 millimeter or 2 on each side. I'm going to twist those leads and then I'm going to tin them myself. While we're tinning these leads, let's go ahead and tin these pads right along here. If you're also installing the FPV Caddx Ant all-in-one, it's a good idea to go ahead and tin your 5 volt as well. Just like before, I'm just going to put a little bit of flux down, hit the ground, the 5, the signal, and the 3. The ground is definitely the easiest one to solder to. If at any point you notice one of your solder joints are bridged, check it with your voltmeter to confirm that it is or is not bridged, and also you can easily drag your solder and let them separate to their separate pads just by removing a little bit of solder from that joint. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with my ground wire. Little tug. The orange wire is going to be my hot, and that's the 3 on the opposite side. And my signal is going to be the grayish white wire, and that's going to go next to my power. And I just like to wind this up just to keep everything nice and clean. Again, if this breaks just simply by handling it, you know your solder joint wasn't very good. So I like to be a little bit on the rougher side, not so much that I damage anything, but just to make sure it takes the wear and tear. Now that we have our harness soldered in for our lemon receiver, before we go ahead and connect that, we're going to install our little tiny ribbon cable that you see here. Now these have very tiny pins, so take your time. We can easily lift this up, and you're going to notice that the pins favor towards the top. Make sure that your connector references that as well, so it easily slides in. Also, you're going to see that it's keyed on the side, so it can really only go in one way. If you find yourself having to force it too much, it's a good chance maybe it's upside down. Same process on the bottom side here. Pins are favoring towards the top. Let those pins favor towards the top, and we'll plug that in. Should slide right in and press it like that. Now we're going to again take note on which side is up, and we can easily fold this lead around right in between the two halves. And then set it down in place. Once you've confirmed that everything's plugged in properly, it's easy to kind of lock in the board now just by using the 4 nuts that are included. And I use my finger. I don't try to lock anything down too tight. Now that we have the 4 nuts firmly screwed down, you can see that our control board is firmly fastened. At this point, if you're not planning on flying FPV, if you're only flying line of sight, we can move on to our next step, which will be mounting our lemon receiver. Now, if you're planning on flying this FPV, now would be a really good time to solder in your Caddx end. And we've been working really hard with Caddx to develop a really great all-in-one. This is a 1200 TV line camera. It's fantastic on fixed-wing airplanes and also tiny little quads like what you see here. What we're going to want to do is we're going to take our 3D printed mount that's included. We want to make sure that this is opened up just wide enough to slide through. Sometimes with the 3D print it's a little tight, so I'm just going to take my razor blade and I'm going to open that up just a little bit. You want to make sure this is opened up enough where it easily slides through, but it's not loose. Once we're happy with the way it fits, we'll slide this up until the point it's ready to press in, and simply by clamshelling this open with a little bit of forward pressure, it'll pop into place. When this screws down on the Guardian, this will close up to a perfect friction fit, and it'll fit perfectly. Next, we're going to locate one of our standoffs, and we're going to mount that to the very front of our quad frame. To get the proper length of where we're going to want to cut our lead, we're going to slide this right over the standoff here. Just a little bit of a friction fit. Make sure we don't pinch any wires passing down. For soldering this in, we're going to cut our red lead so it lines up with the pin in between our ground and our signal wire on the front bank of the control board. And for the ground lead, we're going to run it to the square pad on the back right corner that you see right here. I'm going to keep a little bit of extra wire just in case I have to cut and adjust, or if I want to remove the camera for servicing later. So I got a little bit of slack there, not so much it's going to get in the prop. There's one lead, and we'll tin that. Again, we're keeping the same amount of slop there. Now that we have everything tinned, let's solder on our ground. Little tug, make sure everything's good. And probably the tightest solder of the whole entire job here will be hitting the 5-volt pin right between the ground and the signal. Take your time on this one. And a little tug on that one. It's a really good idea anytime we do a group of soldering to come back and make sure we have continuity where we want continuity and no continuity where we don't. So I'm going to check my 2 grounds. That's perfect. Nothing between my ground and my hot, which is great. Nothing between my signal, and nothing between my 3. So everything looks good. Also, if I take my ground to my main battery leads, everything has continuity. I'm going to go ahead and carefully open this up out of the way. I'm going to take a piece of double-sided tape that's included with my lemon receiver. I'm going to put that back on the back of my lemon receiver, plug it in, and then mount it in place. Always take care whenever we're lining up our connections to make sure that the pins and the holes line up properly and that you're not fighting the end. There we go. And the easiest way to mount a receiver is going to be with the antennas pointing towards the control board. We're going to kind of push that right up in there. We're going to stick it to the bottom of the frame. And we want to make sure that we have enough open space here so when we install our camera back on, it'll slide around and lock into place. There we go. Now at this point, I have my 2 whiskers hanging out. We definitely don't want to cut these. We want to keep these intact. I'm going to carefully slide these underneath our wire leads all the way towards the back of the frame. You're going to see 2 holes that are right next to the pigtail. We're going to pass our antenna down through there. And then what we can do is we can put a little drop of glue on both sides, and that's going to keep the wires from getting tangled with the props. All right, now that everything's soldered, let's go ahead and install the last of our standoffs on our bottom plate, and then we'll do one final check on all the systems. All right, friends, at this point, we are done with the build process. All that is left is simply to install the top plate. But before we do that, we're gonna be handing this over to Wesley to show you how to program this on the computer. Now, most quads use something called Beta Flite. They also have a pass-through to be able to change your motor direction. Wes is gonna guide you through all of that. So make sure you tune into our next video where he's gonna be showing you how to do this. I wanna sincerely thank you for taking time to build with me on the new FT Gremlin Guardian. Can't wait to see you put it up in the air. We'll see you next time.